Hey guys, it's Mele here once again, and the 3.3.0 patch notes for the Incursion League just came out yesterday. Managed to try and get through them all this morning, a few hours ago. I was a little bit hungover from the semi-drunk stream I did last night, so you can check the past two VODs on stream if you want to see just a bit of bullshit drunk stream for no real reason, just a bit of IRL talking about stream and my life. And as well as that, you can check out the entire overview of the patch notes, which took about 2 hours because I go into just about every single point of a little bit of a detail, giving an opinion on every single little note and all of that. So it takes about 2 hours if you want the whole thing. But at this point, I also want to make you guys a quick video. And by quick, I mean like 30 minutes to go over the actual just summation of the 3.3 patch notes, the important stuff that just pops out that hasn't already been covered in the past few weeks. Because there is a lot to get through, and a lot of it is just stuff we've already seen or know about, and it's just stating obvious things like, hey, this is the new league, etc., etc. So I'll try and go over it in something like 30 minutes and just highlight a few of the more important skills, changes, and additions coming in this patch, because it's a pretty big one overall, and Incursion looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. So to kick things off, the first little point is Incursion Challenge League. So Incursion just going to be the new league that you can start in Path of Exile. So they're still going to be standard, still hardcore, but these new leagues are just an opportunity for us to have a fresh economy, fresh characters, and a fresh start in a different setting with some different mods. And in this case, the Incursion mod, which is going to spawn, you're going to find Alva Valai, a random NPC, throughout your adventures in most maps and most zones. And then you talk to her, she opens a portal, you go in. It's a temple-based system where you go through some rooms, you make some decisions, you kill some monsters, and eventually, after getting 11 of these, you can then go into a completed temple and do a bit of a dungeon run in that context. Throughout the Challenge League, there will be, of course, rewards at 12, 24, and 36 challenges. The 12 one is a bandana, which looked kind of meh, I think. At 24, you get the cloak, which did look pretty good, especially for a free cloak that you get just from challenges, though I think it's kind of a reskin. It still looks fairly nice. And at 36, you get a portal, which is a fairly unique looking portal to the current game, so I think it looks pretty good and is not a bad 36-point reward at all. So that's going to be Incursion, bunch of new stuff to kill and area to explore, and overall that does look pretty good for a Challenge League, but the bulk of this patch and league is going to be coming from basically new gems, some reworked gems, and the Vile skill system being reworked. And a lot of that is just going to be revolving around traps. So there's a lot of new traps and the way traps work. And historically, I have not really liked traps or mines or totems or summons, things like that, because they just never felt good, never felt like they were implemented very well. But over the years, things get better, and you do owe it to yourself to still try those things. So you can't just say, oh, I'm never doing traps ever again because it sucked to begin with. At this point, traps do look like they're going to be pretty fun, pretty intuitive, and a fairly nice, successful build to play. So similar with totems that I previously hated for a long time. I tried out totems a few months ago with my Hierophant, and it's so much better than it ever once was that it's just not fair to hate on totems anymore, except for the fact that they're just a little bit more of a bland playstyle compared to some other things. So to start with, the new stuff that they actually added is a new strength gem, Vile Earthquake. So similar to Earthquake, you smash the ground, going to do some damage, but then you will also your steps will also deal damage around you for a duration, cracking the earth if the previous cracks have erupted. So you run around and do additional damage, similar to how Aberath boots work, so you're dealing a bunch of damage just by running around. It seems like it would be pretty cool, and Earthquake itself got a little buff, so it should be usable, and Earthquake plus Vile Earthquake should be a fairly viable build at this point. Then got Vile Blight, which is just going to help your Blight builds or your Chaos damage builds in general do quite a bit of extra burst damage in a lot of context, and I think this should be a highly usable and sought after skill and situation for a lot of these types of builds. You then have Vile Blade Vortex, which didn't really make sense. I didn't really think Blade Vortex needed an extra Vile Blade Vortex, but it should help out a lot in single target and boss fight situations, stacking damage even higher and letting you do a bit of moving around without losing too much damage in that context. We then have Vile Impurities of Fire, Ice, and Lightning. So these things end up penetrating all the enemy resists while they're up. Now they're only going to last 3 or 4 seconds according to the current gem tooltips, but you might be able to build around those as just pure burst damage with characters that don't otherwise get too much resist penetration happening. So I'm not sure it's going to completely negate the need for an Inquisitor, but it should mean that you can get a good bit of burst happening with some other skills, like let's say a Berserker or a Chieftain that doesn't get too much penetration throughout the tree, and if you're elemental based. We then come to the charge trap support. So supported trap skills have a chance to gain frenzy and power charges when your traps are triggered by an enemy. Also grants increased trap throw speed per frenzy and add a crit multi for traps for power charges. Now this is probably going to be one that's fairly useful, but maybe not on your main setup. Maybe on your setup for clearing skills. So if you have a Firetrap that clears things, you attach a couple of good supports to that, and then this one, which gives you power and frenzy charges, you'll still be able to clear monsters and then have a strong single target in something like Flamethrower Trap, which won't have this type of bullshit setup onto it. So it'll be a utility thing, maybe onto your Bear Trap, something like that. Seems like a pretty good support though. We then have a lot of new traps. So Flamethrower Trap, Seismic Trap, Explosive Trap, Siphoning Trap, Lightning Spire Trap. Now the idea behind pretty much all of these is that they're cooldown based traps, so they have a long refresh rate, and you can only have 3 of them ready to go at any one time, and they're really strong. So they should be a single target, your boss killers, that sort of thing. You beef them up quite a lot through, really powerful supports, throw them down when you come across a strong rare or boss, and they should get things killed pretty quickly and within a few little traps. So to me personally, looking over these, and we've already seen previews from Ziggy D in a lot of these, I think something like the Seismic and Explosive Trap is what I might lean towards to begin with when building a initial trapper. So I might start with a trapper to begin with because it does look like a lot of fun, and I'd probably want to try the physical based ones to start with, because they look a bit more fun, and then you can transition into other things like Flamethrower or Lightning Spire if those don't work out. So it's going to be a pretty generic sort of trapper that I would start with and then try and play around with a lot of these new traps. But ultimately, I think I would like to go for the physical based ones because they look like they'd be stronger to scale for damage, though for actual clear and playstyle they might not be the best. So I will keep my mind open for Flamethrower, Lightning Spire, Lightning, Firetrap, all of that sort of stuff. Overall, all of the traps look pretty unique in what they do and bring to the game, and they do look like they're going to be a lot of fun. We then do have a bunch of new uniques, 31 new uniques, 4 of which were designed by supporters, 2 new exiles, which you'll see every now and again, though for the most part you'll blow them up, 22 new div cards, and we already previewed those, they looked quite nice. Then have new corrupted implicits, which can appear on items corrupted by Varlobs, bringing the total to approximately 176. Many of the old implicits were buffed or moved to different items, and some were disabled, but overall they should just be much more powerful, and that's a good thing because there are a lot of implicits that suck for Varl corruptions, and in particular, let's say rings have never really been good. They've always been pretty average, so now if you can get some good corruptions on rings, maybe they'll encourage you to Varl your rings, but overall it's nice to have a bit of a revamp there. And then a huge feature that was added is always attack without moving. So now for every single skill you have, you can click it and then tick an option that will say attack without moving. So that's going to negate the need to always hit shift for attacking with so many skills like, let's say, a Reeve, a Leap Slam, that sort of thing. And instead, you're always just going to be ticking attack without moving, and you won't be running forward and getting yourself killed accidentally or putting yourself into compromising situations. So this is actually a really big deal and should make the game a lot nicer to play. We then get a bunch of new lab enchants for current skills, which is probably just going to function a lot differently thanks to skills being reworked, and 43 new ones for the new skills, mostly those traps, I imagine. And due to just so much rework for a lot of these skills, some enchants are going to be discontinued and just not exist anymore, so there is that too. 6 new Nemesis mods, don't really have any idea what those are going to be yet, but chances are pretty dangerous shit. And then 8 new Grandmasters to the Grandmaster map, and that's probably going to be a lot of extra bullshit exiles that you have to face, so fuck that map. A bunch of 3D art for a lot of new items, or just old items, sorry. You can go through these yourself, but for the most part, there's quite a few nice ones there and a few little useless ones. Overall, it's always nice to see that getting updated. Things like a Piscator's, for example, has a really unique look to it, and it's nice to see that that's going to actually translate finally into the game, because most wands, for example, are just, sticks, and they look terrible. Piscator's itself, it's a nice fish skeleton, and it looks really cool. And then they also mentioned that the 2D and 3D art of Tabula Rasa has been updated so that it's not garbage anymore. This was previewed like a year and a half ago or some shit, and it looked really good, and finally it's going to be put into the game, and it should make characters look a lot nicer at this point, because a lot of characters use tabulas and don't really want to chuck on any other MTX. As always, ground effects of all types have been updated, and better for performance. That's always a welcome change. Doesn't seem to be too much of a problem these days, but I have a pretty good computer now anyway. Targets for the Pale Council prophecy chains now show up on the minimap, so that's a bit easier to get your prophecy chains done. Several skill performance optimizations, most notably Molten Strike's performance at high projectile volumes. So currently with Molten Strike, if you have Ancestral Call, a lot of extra ball projectiles and really fast attack speed, you potato your PC really hard because you're throwing out 100 balls a second or something, a lot of them, and you just start to tank your FPS. What they've said is that with this, it means that Molten Strike's projectiles are going to land faster and disappear faster, so you shouldn't have as many going through your screen at a single time, which is going to be a big performance increase for Molten Strike. World and map areas can now have multiple sub-areas, which means, for example, find a Zana mission in the same map as a Lab Trial, Abyssal Depths, or an Elder Guardian. So previously you couldn't do that, it'd be like one or the other. So now your maps can have quite several different layers to them, but it does mean you have to manage your time a bit better with that, and yeah, it's just something that probably needed to be changed at this point. And besides that, there's not too much else that's really terribly important, just always improving stuff, I suppose. As for character balance, the modifiers to skill duration no longer modify the duration of traps, totems, or mines, but will continue to modify the duration of skills cast by traps, totems, and mines if those skills have a duration. So for example, if you attach a reduced duration or less duration gem to your totem, no longer will it be then reducing the duration of the totem, only of the skill. So if you do that for a lightning warp totem, for example, it will be benefiting the skill and not reducing the totem duration. So that seems like a nice little quality of life there. Ignite, supposedly going to be buffed, so 50% of the ignite over 4 seconds, up from 40%, which is a solid 25% buff, along with all the other buffs that are coming too. And you can now have up to 15 traps active at a time, up from 3 as the base. You then have skill balance. Supports which cause skills to create traps, totems, or mines will no longer grant that skill the duration tag. So just a bit of a, nuance there. And then we have a lot of trap stuff here. So most of these skills have just been updated, and traps in particular, there's going to be a lot of changes there, a lot of numerical things. I'll try and just sum them up fairly quickly and give strengths and weaknesses of them. Overall, traps got a bit of a rework with how they're going to function, and things like your Firetrap, Lightning Trap, Ice Trap, and traps attached to skills will no longer have cooldowns. So you can spam them, and it's just up to kind of your throwing speed and all of that. So to begin with, Firetrap no longer has a cooldown. It's now level 12, does some different amounts of damage, and the biggest change there is that the burn damage that it leaves on the ground is a lot higher than it used to be, and now has a duration of 1.75 seconds, and it's going to be a lot more sort of burn based. So initial hit is pretty good, but then you've got a lot of extra burning damage and a bunch of extra damage effectiveness. Should just be a nice clear skill, and then your flamethrower trap will be your single target type of thing. We then have Bear Trap, that was a little bit reworked, and the biggest take-home message here is that Bear Trap's probably going to be in just about every single trap build, because it gives you an additional 15% increased damage from traps and mines when it hits something else, so that buffs all your other shit, and also slows things down quite dramatically. Now, Ziggy D previewed this in one of his videos, and it looked really powerful against, let's say, the Phoenix Guardian, which is the one he used it on, because it slows them down very dramatically, and that should be very useful in a lot of encounters, not even necessarily just for trap builds. Bear Trap could be a pretty big staple in a lot of builds. And then you can use it for utility to get frenzies and power charges with those other support gems. Lightning Trap itself has always been a pretty decent clear skill. Now it has no cooldown and a lot more effective damage. It's got higher crit chance based off of shocking, and you can throw them all over the place. And Lightning Trap will probably be a very nice clear and a very good clearing skill paired with some stronger stuff, and should see quite a lot of use, I think. So Lightning Trap's definitely one to look out for. Probably one of the ones you want to start a character with when going for traps initially. Ice Trap got fucked, so it no longer has a cooldown like the rest of them, but it got nerfed in damage, and it's still got pretty bad area. Historically, it never had very good area since the area nerfs, and that hasn't changed here, so I doubt Ice Trap's going to see too much use, to be honest, because it never got buffed on area, and ultimately it just got worse damage. So I'm not sure about that one at all. And then Conversion Trap is a thing. So then for specific skill changes, we have a lot of changes, and once again I'll try and just sum them up a little bit as to what they will be doing, what they did before, and if it's any good. But overall, just about everything got a buff. There's buffs everywhere, as opposed to little nerf patches and all that. This is just buffs. So there's a lot of skills for us to now play around with and have some new life breathed into them. And I'll just go over them fairly quickly so that we can get an idea as to what they do, but read it in detail as you want. And they did just give us all of the skill gems. Let's see, right here, that you can hover over and actually have a look at if you want to see it in greater detail. So with the Infernal Blow changes, a lot of stuff is happening here. Basically, it's supposed to give you a better single target damage and slightly better explosion stuff. Overall, it looks like a nice little buff, and Infernal Blow currently clears pretty well and is played pretty well with your Ancestral Call, and this should just make it a bit nicer for your single target, bridging the gap a bit between Blade Flurry and things like an Infernal Blow. Though it doesn't look like it'll be anywhere near competitive to a Blade Flurry still, it should be a lot nicer to actually use. Rain of Arrows, from the preview we saw, it does cover a lot more ground. Instead of just having one hit all come down at once, it now has lots of multiple hits coming down all over the place. And it's going to be, I think, one of those just wait and see skills. You got to try it. You got to see if it's going to feel any good. But overall, it looks like it's going to be one of the craziest skills out there, or crazier skills and reworks out there. And it could be a lot of fun, and maybe make early leveling for bows with less gear a lot nicer. And on top of that, Rain of Arrows looks like it's going to help a lot for single target and gameplay as well. So Rain of Arrows looks like it should be a pretty nice one. Charge Dash, they kind of reworked it a bit so that it's a lot more intuitive to play, and instead of just charging it up and then releasing and going forward, you can now kind of move your mouse cursor and, you know, pick a sort of path as to where you're going with it. And this is going to be another one where you just have to kind of play around with it. Currently, not too many people like Charge Dash. I'm kind of a fan of it though. When you first pick it up at level 28, typically with shitty gear, Charge Dash ends up actually feeling better than most skills. It's not up until like the maps and the harder bosses and all of that that Charge Dash starts to feel worse and less good than other skills. But early on, I think it feels really good, and I do encourage you guys to try it out if your character doesn't feel great up until, you know, level 28, and then at 28, Charge Dash usually makes your character feel pretty nice, and with these changes, it may help the single target out. Hopefully it does, because I do kind of like this skill. Now Incinerate got completely reworked. It's nothing like what it used to be. Still kind of a channel where you stand still and shoot fire, but it's very different to what it used to be. And you've seen, or should have seen by now, ZD's preview of it. But hopefully it looks like it can do some good Ignite damage. Might be a premier Ignite skill of choice. I'm still not sure it's going to be too competitive, because it is a sort of standstill and channel sort of thing, and without a lot of area, that's not going to feel good compared to a lot of other skills, but it could at least be fun and might be good for Ignite. Overall, it looks pretty good, and should be something to play around with at the very least. Ground Slam, just got a slight buff across the board basically. It can now be used with axes, and it got a bit of damage just onto the actual skill itself, so nice like 10-20% damage gain early on. And then ultimately, the closer you are, says now deals damage in a cone in front of the attacker based on weapon damage, but also deals up to 40% more damage to closer targets, up to 50% at level 20. So it should be a lot stronger for single target than it used to be, and I think that should make it much more competitive, but probably still a lot worse than Sunder for clearing. So try it out at your own risk. It'll be good for single target, and clear probably kind of average at this point, I think. We're then looking at Cold Snap, and previously it just, slammed something with a bit of cold damage and had a shitty freeze. At this point it got a lot more damage and now has a Vortex sort of damage over time area that it creates that should be used for just more or less utility still, I think, which gives you 25% chance to grant a frenzy charge when an enemy dies while inside that cold damage over time. So I think a lot of builds should be able to use this as a utility rather than pure damage. Just chuck it onto a pack or onto a rare monster, something like that, and you should be able to get frenzies for your build, for your other skills, because it's kind of hard to get frenzies otherwise for casters sometimes. So overall, I doubt this is going to see too much use in craziness, but definitely going to see some utility action from this one. And then Power Siphon got reworked to have a bit less damage at the gem levels, much better mana cost, 20 crit per power charge, increased critical strike chance per power charge, 10% crit multi per power charge. So typically you have like 5 charges, so we're saying 100 crit, 50 multi, 20% chance to gain power charges when you hit a rare or unique enemy, so sustain should be a bit nicer there, and then 4 additional projectiles at gem level 1 and 7 at gem level 20. So it's going to be sort of like in a 180 degree in front of you, attack up to 7 enemies or so, and with chain it should feel pretty good as a Deadeye, but ultimately it's not going to hold any sort of a candle compared to Kinetic Blast, and it probably won't be that good for single target. Based off of these changes, it won't be much better than it currently is, and it probably won't be really anything compared to a top tier barrage still, but I think on the lower end, and especially at the start of wanding, it should be a nice skill to use at this point, and it's definitely a lot better than it used to be. And then I have a couple of interesting ones here for the melee skills. Now that is Double Strike. It now deals a bunch of extra flat physical damage per gem level, up to 113 to 169 against bleeding enemies at gem level 20. So your swords and axes going double strike, getting some bleed on the target, getting that much extra physical at level 20. I think that's going to be pretty damn nice. Slight nerf in base damage there and gives you plus weapon range. This paired with the Vile Double Strike that's coming a bit later down the patch notes, looks like it'll be actually really insane. So Double Strike with Ancestral Call should be a lot of fun and do a lot of damage. And then on top of that, Vile Double Strike for additional clear and single target. I think this is going to be a crowd favorite, or at least I might try it out to begin with. Likewise with Lacerate, so a lot of the downsides of Lacerate got removed. It now has normal attack speed. It now gives you 25% more damage with hits, and was reduced in some of the damage it previously had to cancel out those things. It gives you a lot more area. Now to begin with, it's still going to have dog shit area, so bear in mind it's going to be terrible early on, because the area at level 1 is still going to be really bad, and it also gives you 25% chance to cause bleeding on hit. It should be competitive with some other skills for sure at this point, and I think it'll be a very nice one to play. Competitive with a Double Strike probably, and another melee skill that you can try out on your generic sort of melee physical characters. But bear in mind, Sunder will probably clear faster early on, and this is one of those that's going to take some ramping into later stages to feel good. We then have a really big change in Arc in that it just gained a bunch of lower end damage, so that it's smoothened out its damage curve a bit. It now deals 15% more damage for each remaining chain, and you can get up to, let's say, 9 or 10 chains. So that's going to like double your damage on single target quite comfortably, and can now split to an extra enemy, and whenever it chains, these splits cannot chain. So basically when you're chaining, like let's say 7 times, going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, to all those different monsters, it can now at every one of those points chain to an extra enemy. That's just kind of a fork, an additional fork going into different enemies. So it should be even better clear speed than it currently has, which is pretty good. And then on top of that, with things like Impulses and Herald of Ice, it should have some really nuts clear speed, and the actual more damage here should make it a fairly competitive single target skill. It also chains 4 times at level 1. Previously there was only like 2, so it was hard to level with. Now you can actually level with it pretty effectively, and I do think that a Arc Totems character, similar to the one I did last league, should be pretty nuts now and should be very comfortable to level with. So Arc, that's definitely one to keep your eye on. And then Elemental Hit has a pretty big rework, so it's been basically changed up from the ground up. And best way is probably just have a look at this actual skill gem. So over here, Elemental Hit. It now has a lot more damage, fire, cold, lightning, all of that. And it can only deal one damage, one type of elemental damage at a time. So if you hit with the fire damage, you're only going to be dealing fire damage through that hit and no lightning or cold. And it still alternates through those damage types. So we'll go fire, cold, lightning, but it tries to not pick fire in a row twice like that, so it does try to alternate, making it better for elemental equilibrium. However, you can't stack lots of flat elemental damage everywhere without converting, because if you do that, you'll only be hitting with fire and wasting your cold, for example, if you have additional cold onto your fire. But there are threshold jewels that will then let you just pick one of these. So if you get a two threshold jewels that take out the cold and lightning, you'll only be dealing fire damage, and you can build an entire fire-based elemental hit character. It's got a lot of damage. It should be pretty nice for range, probably even for Ancestral Call melee. And then as well as that, you actually get increased area and area splash sort of thing when you hit a target that's already shocked, ignited, or chilled for its respective damage. Overall, it actually looks pretty crazy and should be a fairly nice skill to play around with at this stage, but it'll be one we have to keep an eye on and see how it feels to actually play, because it's not really going to take over Kinetic Blast, it's not going to take over Lightning Arrow, but it might be good for some different stuff, for some single targets maybe, and maybe some Ancestral Call action. We then change from big skill reworks into basically just skill adjustments and tweaks, and to start with we have across the board, basically, lightning skills just look better, lightning spells in particular. So to start with, Storm Burst has something like 3 times more damage on its projectiles, but its area damage goes down from 250 to 65, so it's a lot less reliant on the projectiles that travel and then explode, doing the area damage, and a lot more reliant on the actual projectiles themselves. So I think this looks like it should be pretty nice to clear with now, and actually a pretty fun skill to try out. So if you're going to try Arc, definitely try out Storm Burst at around level 28 and see how you like it. I think it should be pretty strong. Orbis Storms then gained like twice as much damage, and I think currently with the way Orbis Storms works and its increase to cast speed affecting the strike rate here, with an Elementalist, for example, using the Prolift nodes, you should be able to get quite a lot of damage and clear out of Orbis Storms, so I'd keep my eye on that as well if you're doing a lightning-based character. Maybe attach a few good damage supports to it. It could actually be very useful for damage and clear, so definitely something to try out. Ball Lightning got like a pretty decent damage buff, almost double or so, and as well as that, it now travels faster and hits faster, so that it actually travels faster while still dealing a same amount of damage, let's just say, so that it's a better clear skill. So overall, Ball Lightning's looking pretty good there too, and a very nice buff there. Bladefall, not too much has really changed there, not much to really mention. Earthquake, pretty big change in that the Aftershock effect went from 1.5 second base to 1 second base. That basically eliminates the need for the Helm enchant and will make your Aftershock damn near instant with the less duration support. If you can also get the Helm enchant, then it gets pretty crazy, and it also deals more damage as the gem levels, so now 69% more at gem level 20, up from 50, so a nice damage buff there too. The area on Earthquake isn't very good, but you might be able to make it good enough with a lot of area and also some bleed explosions, for example, but that's one you should probably try out as well if you're playing a melee character. Flame Surge, just going to have a lot more single target damage, 88 instead of 50% more against burning enemies, so a nice single target there. Firestorm got a slight buff, Frostbomb got a slight buff in damage, doesn't really matter, you don't care about its damage typically unless you want to throw some traps with it. People might play around with that. But for the most part, its buff for the minus 25 cold res is now going to last 5 seconds, and that should be really nice in your cold damaging characters. So your Frostblades and that sort of thing. Definitely something you should be using in those characters and builds, and it is quite a bit nicer now. Fireball got a huge buff, like, I don't know, 20% damage or something, bunch of area, a bunch of cast speed, and a lot better on ignite damage. So this should be one of the premier ignite skills when building around ignite with your elementalists. And I think ignite at this stage looks like it should clear very nicely. I'm not too sold on its single target yet. We're going to have to wait and see for that one. And likewise with Flame Blast, it did get a bunch of extra ignite damage. or ailment damage, so it should also be one of the premier Ignite skills out there, and I think it should clear pretty well as well with Ignite and Prolift. And Magma Orb got a bit of extra damage, which I don't think it really needed, so hell yeah, why not? And the speed at which the projectiles bounce has been significantly increased, so now it's a lot less necessary to get proj speed in your ball Magma Orbs, and it should clear really nicely too. So overall, Magma Orb is a pretty big winner in my book for skills when built correctly, and this buff is very much welcome. So with Gloomfang, these things should be pretty nuts. You then have Spark that got just a bit of a buff across the board once again after all the nerfs it kept receiving, so it just brought it back a bit in line with what it used to be, but I don't think it's exciting enough to compete with, let's say, an Arc at this stage. So it's probably more viable, but probably not one of the more exciting things. Body Swap, nothing. Blade Vortex was pretty much reworked, so it now has 10 blades instead of 20. It hits faster for more blades you have, more ailment damage, and has a bit of extra crit. Overall, it should be, I think, a slight damage buff, but the idea here is that you have to maintain less stacks of your Blade Vortex throughout mapping and bossing, which makes it just a much nicer skill to use and a much more reliable skill during your endgame boss fights. So Blade Vortex didn't really need a buff. Fuck it, it got one. Blade Vortex Elementalist could be a very good starter, and it might be one that I recommend. It's similar to the one I played in the last league. EK got, I don't know, nothing. I think it gained 2 damage or something, so that's really cool. It's not very good anyway. Blade Vortex, that's your man. Blast Rain got pretty reworked to have a lot more competitive damage and be a lot more fire-based. And overall, I don't think it's really going to compete with Barrage too much, but it's something you guys can play around with. It's just the delay on the Blast Rain going down at this stage doesn't feel great, but it is something to keep an eye on. It could be decent enough when built correctly to compete with Barrage, and Barrage gained a 4th projectile up from 3 because its damage got nerfed, and the idea here was to kind of not eliminate, but really make additional projectiles and arrows worse the more you get of them, so that they're not as impactful for your build, so that your +1 arrow quiver or something isn't going to be as good as it used to be, but it is still the best way to scale this shit. And then Freezing Pulse got a bunch of extra damage and should feel a lot better because the projectile now moves more quickly at the start and slowly decelerates, and the damage now drops to 50% at max distance rather than 0. And it also looks a lot cooler. So Freezing Pulse looks like a pretty cool skill now and should be very viable, but for the most part, chuck it in your Cosprey's Malice builds and it's just going to be better now. And the last few changes here, we have Ice Crash and Dorani's Touch can now both be supported by Multi-Strike. They're pretty slow and the area isn't great for them. I'm not sure you even want Multi-Strike in shit like this. It might feel better in some cases, but it's going to lock you down pretty hard in other cases, so not too sure about that one. And then nothing else too important there, and Vile skill changes. So there's the main point here that Vile skills are going to be completely different to how they used to be, and the biggest thing is you will be able to get Vile skill souls for your Vile skills throughout damaging rares and unique enemies. So damaging a rare enemy now generates 1 Vile soul per 2% life it loses with a 1-second cooldown, which is a bit of a bitch. And then damaging unique enemies now generates 3 Vile souls per 2% life it loses with a 1-second cooldown. So if you have a build that can take down a big boss's health in 20% of its health over the course of 10 seconds, you'll get your 30 Vile souls. You'll then be able to use most Vile skills with that amount of souls, and that helps you burn the boss down a bit faster after that. It's a pretty welcome change, I think, in that it becomes just a much more useful skill and tool in your arsenal against bosses, especially ones that you can't generate souls against previously, like a Shaper or an Uber Elder, all of that sort of shit. And the other big reworks are basically that after you use a Vile skill, you can't generate Vile souls for that skill for like typically 4 seconds or so. So that's to prevent you just plain chaining Vile skills, using a Vile Fireball, for example, and then having that Vile Fireball refill your souls and then going again with a Vile Fireball so that it just becomes your clear skill. So it's supposed to be just a powerful addition for certain situations and boss fights. And as well as that, all of the Vile skill gems now also grant the base version of the skill at the same level and quality as the Vile gem. So if you have a Vile Burning Arrow in your setup, in your 5 or 6 link, You then also have the burning arrow, so it's only one gem that does both things now. So just about every skill out there that has a Vile skill should be using their Vile skill at some point in some situations. So that's a really nice change to have too. And then we get into the rework for a lot of these Vile skills. Now I've gone over most of the important stuff already, so I'll try and skip over some things here or there from here on out and wrap this shit up. So the first one is Vile Lightning Strike. So it's basically going to be a beacon or a point you put on the ground that then does damage on its own. So essentially like a totem, really. Should help out for single target in a lot of situations. You then have Vile Arc, which is kind of crazy, I suppose. Previously, it was just something that chained a lot of times all over the place. Now it deals insanely more damage, like just about double. It deals 15% more damage for each remaining chain, and it chains at least 5 times to begin with, and it gets higher as it levels. Increased effective shock by 100%. And causes your arc to be lucky for 4 seconds after using it, which means that lucky just means it's going to roll the damage twice and pick the higher number. So basically your damage is then lucky, and you then can't get Vile Souls for 4 seconds after use. And overall it looks like it's going to be crazy damage and a huge boost to your arc single target damage. So something that your arc builds should definitely be using when they're self-casting at the very least. Then a Vile Cold Snap, which as far as I can tell is like a cold righteous fire, I think, that's going to generate some frenzy charges for the duration of that skill. So for 4 seconds it just has a circle around you, which just gives you extra damage and damage over time, and then gives you frenzy charges. So it could be utility for frenzy charge gain throughout map clear and all that. Vile Detonate Dead would just explode everything on the map. It could chain to before. Now it's going to just set sort of a marker or a totem similar to your Vile Lightning Strike, and then blow up corpses up to 22 corpses, and it deals an insane amount of damage. Previously 250 to 370, now 1200 to 1800 at gem level 20, with some corpse explosion damage too. And overall, with your Unearth totem going off or your Desecrate just being spammed, this seems like it's going to do quite a lot of extra boss damage. So that's one to definitely keep in mind in quite a lot of spellcasting builds that can afford to have corpses and Unearth totems at their disposal, especially the actual Detonate Dead builds. Vile Double Strike is going to be pretty crazy. You can have 2 of yourself running around with you instead of just the 1 from before, and it's going to have a longer duration. Now has more melee range. It now just is going to be a lot more fun because it moves a lot faster. Should help you in clear speed quite a bit nicely, and also in your single target, and it has a bunch of extra physical damage similar to how actual Double Strike interacts. And this could be one of my starting characters as well, so it's one I'm going to keep an eye on. Vile Rain of Arrows now just throws out a bunch of arrows into the sky and hits stuff, so it now fires a number of arrows across the area, dealing damage based on weapon damage with each one. Half of these arrows will target enemies in the area, while the rest will target the area at set ranges from the center at random, and it's then repeated 3 additional times. So a shitload of arrows are going to come down. It sounds like it's going to be good for single target. It maims things at an increased effective rate, and that's one that you're probably going to use in maybe most bow builds, just for your boss fights and all that. Should be pretty good overall, I think. Vile Ground Slam deals a shitload of damage, and just as it used to in a big area, so kind of like an earthquake but much stronger. One time, has a decent area, has a lot of damage, like 300% weapon damage or so. Should be pretty crazy, I think. Vile RF, basically just a much stronger version of RF for the duration of the actual skill itself, so like 4 seconds or some shit. Instead of just exploding yourself and almost killing you, it's now just a really beefed up version of RF, so it should help you burn enemies down in your Righteous Fire builds. That's one that's probably going to see a lot of use. Vile Flame Blast, I'm not really even sure what's going on there. Vile Stormcall, it's probably going to be pretty nice for a lot of lightning skill builds, or especially Stormcall, I suppose, but I'm not sure it's too necessary. Maybe Vile Blade Vortex is going to overtake it in additional single target for this sort of shit anyway, but it's similar to how it used to be, which you place a marker, it's going to strike the ground, except it does more area damage rather than single target. Could be useful. I think that's a wait and see. And then Vile Power Siphon, just slightly better across the board, but still does the same thing. Then got slight buffs to a bunch of these rather than reworks. So Vile Lightning Trap, just better a bit. Vile Spectral Throw, a little bit better, has 4 projectiles just by its default. I think you're rarely going to see any use out of this because Spectral Throw by itself already does everything it needs to, and Vile Spectral Throw is just a bit weird to use otherwise, so I'm not sure. It's just kind of a novelty, I think. Vile Burning Arrow, just a beefed up version of Burning Arrow for ignite damage. So this, for the most part, is, I think, only going to see use if you're building into heavy amounts of ignite damage for your Burning Arrow builds. Vile Fireball got a lot more damage and a lot more everything, I guess, so it should be nice for clearing in your Ignite Fireball builds. Just a nice additional big sort of attack throughout those big monster packs and all of that, and good for Ignite, but not something you're supposed to chain. And then a bunch of little reworks here or there for souls and all of that. Now, coming down to the support gem balance, the things that really take my eye here are trap support. No longer grants a supported skill more trap damage. Now it just has no cooldown, so you attach it to your arc, for example. You can throw as many arc traps as you can stomach while doing so. The multiplier of the mana went down quite a lot, so you should be able to play around with traps and skills quite a lot with these new trap support stuff. Trap and mine damage support's a really big gem now at 49% damage, so that should be used in probably almost every single trap build. Endurance charge on melee stun now does 4% more damage per endurance charge, so your jugs that have 9, 10 endurance charges should see quite a bit of use out of this one, I think, for things like Tectonic Strike probably. Chance to Ignite is now a combustion support instead, which is a really nice fire gem. It has minus fire resistance for enemies, ignite and fire damage, I think, so it's a pretty big one for most fire builds. As far as power charge on crit here, now causes supported skills to deal 4% more damage per power charge. So some builds should definitely be using this one in their skill setups. If you're an assassin that's running dual void batteries and 9 power charges, that's a shitload of extra damage, 36% more, and very reliable power charge on crit. Likewise with an occultist or some other things. That's a pretty nice change here. And then lastly, Ignite Prolif support got beefed up to deal quite a lot more damage, so now causes supported skills to deal 20% more damage with Ignite level 1 and 39% at level 20. So when you're going for your Ignite builds and getting your Ignite Prolif happening, this is going to be a big support gem because it gives you 39% more and prolifts all of your shit. And then Ancestral Call can no longer support Vile skills, so we don't have Ancestral Call attached to our Vile Double Strike. I think with Mele Splash it still should be good, but just a bit of a downside there. And for the most part, I think Vile Double Strike is just there for our single target anyway. The passive tree got somewhat rebalanced just for trap stuff. You should probably explore that yourself in Path of Building. Whip open Path of Building, update it, and have a look at all the little changes that happened. The main ascendancy balance that happened here is that Elementalist Beacon of Ruin now prolifts in 18 radius, up from 12, and it no longer grants 20 increased effect of non-damaging ailments, and instead grants 20% more damage with Ignite. So it is the premier Ignite sort of character at this stage, and it becomes a bit worse on your shock effectiveness, though I think it should still be really good and still see quite a lot of use for all those lightning and shock builds, but it probably means that Inquisitor is just a little bit more tasty at this point. There was a bunch of item balance here, nothing too special that we really need to focus on except for the arc enchantments now only give 1 additional chain or 2 additional chain from the Uber Lab, and that's still pretty nice, but it just becomes less necessary getting all of your additional single target damage in. Unique item balance, I'm going to have to say there wasn't too much really to mention here. Writhing Jar now destroys the worms after they're hit, so that your Ignite Prolif won't be really that relevant. Diatus got kind of weaker for burning damage, though I'm not sure too many people would be using that anyway in that sort of context. And besides that, I'd say there's not much else to mention. There is a threshold jewel for Cold Snap that instead of overriding the cooldown with Frenzy, you can make it do power charges instead. So that's just a bit of a flavor balance for your Cold Snap if you're going to go into that and do that sort of thing. Monster balance, I don't think there's too much really necessary to talk about here. Niam got a bit easier, I think, and Bammoth got a little bit harder just because of Detonate Dead being casted faster. And Yep, that's fine there. And then map balance, the big one here is that once you have completed 20 maps while the Elder Guardians are on your atlas, without actually defeating any of them, there is a chance for the Elder Guardians to disappear and remove the Elder influence from maps. So previously people would try and get Elder rings happening around their atlas and just run Elder maps non-stop. But now if you have your Elder spawn with the Guardians and you run 20 of those Elder maps without killing any of those Guardians, there's a chance that it just disappears altogether and you got to start again. So that does also help people out that can't kill their Elder or their Uber Elder if they've spawned him, and means that you can just wipe them off the map and start again. So that is a pretty big change, especially for the people doing Elder rings. For the most part, that shouldn't be a negative for most of us because not too many people actually do that. And there's not much else to mention there, just a few maps got a little bit of changes. The Zana League mods, nothing too special except for the fact that Breach is going to be level 8 again, gives you 2 breaches for 6C. Abyss is going to be level 7, only gives you 1 Abyss. I think that's a bit weak, I would have thought at least 2 Abysses. Witch is now going to get Herald of Ash as a quest reward, so that's really good because previously she doesn't do that, even though she's very Herald based as an Elementalist. And I think that's for the most part all I need to talk about. Holy shit. These patch notes just get bigger and bigger, and as a streamer I am dying, or content creator rather, I am dying having to do this because going over this really hurts, talking that much, analyzing that much, and explaining that much. But I do feel it is something I should do because a lot of you people would really benefit from just having a slightly outside perspective, because no one really wants to read all of this. You're probably just control F'ing a few things that you want to check in on, and otherwise getting highlight clips from other people and summaries. I certainly don't want to read it, but I do feel it's my duty, and there we go, we finally did it. So Incursion League, I think it looks pretty damn good. Like I said, for the most part, the actual content isn't the Incursion, it's the rework of all the skills, the addition of all the traps, and I think it's going to be giving us quite a lot of fun for at least a good couple of months and keep us very busy. It's going to keep me very busy because I love trying out new skills, new builds, and it's going to be, I think, one of the best leagues yet, in my opinion. So thank you very much for watching, guys. I should have a starter build video up within the next day or so, hopefully once I pick a few starter builds for you all. And yeah, hope you enjoy your next few days waiting. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.